Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd just like to say a little bit about our agency for those who are joining us for the first time. The Center for Disability Empowerment offers supports and services to anyone with any disability of any age. And our mission is to provide those services and supports to empower individuals with disabilities to live and work, go to school, to play and worship alongside those who don't have disabilities, so that they can be participants and contributors in their communities. So we've begun to pursue an inclusive communities initiative itself to encourage towns and cities to make the commitment to become welcoming and inclusive places for everyone. To that end, we've hosted a series of community conversations on this topic presented by Dr. Condeluci. Sadly for us, it's kind of bittersweet. This is the last of those discussions, but we're so excited to culminate them with the key ingredients for community success discussion today. Dr. Condeluci has been a leader in community building and human services and inclusive advocacy work for the past 50 years. He holds a PhD and an MSW from the University of Pittsburgh. And he's been the CEO of CLASS, which stands for Community Living and Support Services, which is a major nonprofit community building organization in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He holds faculty status at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Social Work and Health Rehab Sciences, and is the author of 7 books, including the acclaimed Interdependence, the Route to Community, and more recently, Social Capital, the Key to Macro Change. He serves as a consultant, advisor, and human services coach, and is on a number of nonprofit and government commissions on state, local, and national levels. He helped found and convenes the Interdependent Network, which is an international coalition of professionals, family members, and consumers who are interested in community engagement and macro change, just as we are. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Al. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue, and welcome everyone who's plugged in. I understand we have close to 150 folks logged into our talk today. And as Sue indicated, it's the last of a 5-part series that we put together with the center in terms of thinking about the very goal and direction that Sue had just articulated that the center holds, which is getting people invested, involved, and incorporated, all people incorporated into community. Now we know that when communities have diversity in them, they're better, they're more vibrant, they're stronger, they become more welcoming and inclusive. A lot of good things happen with diversity, and not just disability related diversity, but general diversity in our communities. It creates this mosaic of people working towards the same thing. So welcome. Glad you're with us. And today, with our culmination, we're really going to, in fact, turn our attention to the kinds of ways we can make community a better place for us all. So if you've been following in the series, and we assume that a number of you on this call today have been plugged in from the very first time, this voyage that we started really initiated by looking at social isolation and loneliness. And we explored that phenomena pretty closely. We looked at some of the underpinnings. We defined social isolation and loneliness, and we discovered certainly in the research that there are groups of people at greater risk of social isolation and loneliness, and that with social isolation, bad things happen. When people are isolated, health disparities become an issue. Depression is an issue. Folks really become stagnant and static in their lives. And again, this whole notion of social isolation has been a generic exploration in our culture and really around the world. Other countries have really vested their focus on social isolation. And here in the United States, insurance companies and third-party payers have really gotten interested in understanding isolation and loneliness, because we know that when either individuals or groups of people are isolated, that costs increase, increased healthcare costs, increased support costs unfold. And so we looked at that. We really then identified in that process that the antidote or the way we deal with social isolation and loneliness is to help people build social capital, build relationships. And so our second session focused in on social capital, what it means, how it gets developed, what it does for us individually, what it does for our communities collectively. As we explored and examined social capital in that second session, we identified some steps that are viable in helping people build a social capital. Obviously, you have to be in the community in order to really begin to build relationships. It's so difficult to build relationships from afar. Even with things like Zoom, it's difficult to build a relationship because, here we are 150 of us and we're together engaging, but we're in our little isolated bubbles. You can see me on a screen, I can see you on a screen, but in terms of baiting the opportunity for us to begin to develop a relationship with each other really does require that you actually engage in community. And so that brought us to our third session, which was really understanding community and mapping the community, examining what's available in our communities for people to plug into, what are the places and the spaces where people can come together on a regular basis to form relationships and friendships. Right? And so in that session, we looked at community mapping and we talked about identifying the various kinds of resources, clubs, groups, associations, gathering points where people might be able to connect. But as we ended that session, that third session, and by the way, these are all captured on the center's YouTube channel. So if you missed any of these sessions, we welcome you to plug into our YouTube. Jamie talked about the availability of each of these sessions on that medium. So if you missed something, please double back and check it out. But what we discovered in our third session at the end of the session is that we could identify community resources. That's not that terribly hard, but the challenge is, will that community resource be receptive to somebody new? Will they open up their arms? Will they welcome in someone who has never really been a part of that community setting? That brought us to our fourth session, which was understanding the social infrastructure of a community group or of a community gathering point. And we examined some of the key things that are that make up the social infrastructure of a community group. And we looked at what are the things that would soften that community infrastructure so that someone new who has never been a part of that community setting has the opportunity to be welcomed and to engage. And we talked about regularity and similarity. We talked about gatekeepers and other players who can, in fact, welcome folks into the community in understanding the social infrastructure. And that brings us then to our session today, which is our concluding session that really now focuses in on macro ideas to, in fact, not just soften, but to create the attitudinal sort of basis of a culture that includes everyone, right? And so this session is really going to be different, I think, than probably many in-service webinar sessions that you might have had in the past, because we're going to examine things that you and I or organizations might do in our community that really are separate from from engaging a person who has been left behind and getting them connected. But these are just things that will create better communities, softer, more welcoming communities. So with that in tow, let's get started with our program. We're really looking now today at changing community really from the inside out, and bringing some things into community that would make that community more palatable and more viable for people to join, because we know that all people, any of us on this call, want to be involved in community. We are social animals, and we have this social sort of link to other people, and we want to be productive, and we want to be treated with dignity, and we want to be able to get around and not just get into, but become of our community groups, so that we can begin to build relationships. These are things that all people want. We actually covered this earlier in our series. And we also know that when people have problems, they first try to solve those problems through a system, through a community system that might be out there. However, we know that systems are formalized, and oftentimes most of the more robust ways that we solve our problems are through each other that we come to know and come to be with in community. Our human service system that we have often and we turn to is micro-oriented, and it does assessments, and it attempts to fix problems. But our agenda today is really to begin to think about, when we gather here for this series, the human service system really hasn't created, a community inclusion kind of agenda. Most agencies, most organizations that serve people who are vulnerable, do that in isolated kinds of ways, through their programs, through their services. They reach in and attempt to help people, but most of our human service agencies are really not community minded. We don't see us as having a role in building community and investing in community. We see our role as helping a vulnerable individual or family who's struggling with a particular issue, right? And so there's this sort of juxtaposition between human service agencies and viable community, and those two oftentimes remain apart, right? And so part of the, I think, spirit of this session is really to think about what kind of investments do human service agencies, or we as individuals, need to make in our communities in sort of moving forward. Because we know this micro macro phenomena, and we've looked at it, we've talked about it, right? We know that there are micro things we can do with individuals, or there are macro things we can do with community, right? And again, most of our agencies stay, unless they're community development organizations. I know we might have some community development organizations that are plugged into this webinar, and those organizations really do have a more macro agenda of how do we invest in strengthening our community. But many of the other, I think, individuals who are plugged into our series and certainly are with us today represent organizations that have a sort of a really focused agenda with a core group of people that they're responsible for. Right? And so we know that micro change is a clinical kind of a thing. We've talked about that before. We know that micro change has a model to it that is very, very focused on an individual. So we're serving people. We know that they might be isolated and lonely, and then we focus attention on how they might be able to, in fact, make change happen. Macro change, on the other side, is this environmental kind of scan, and this notion of not just identifying resources in community, but looking at ways that we can strengthen them and make them more viable toward the agenda that we have. And so we know that the problem is really not the person here. Really, the issue is the community. How might the community be more pliable and more accessible to folks? And so as we kind of move through this notion of building relationships, says that the places and spaces that we identify have really got to begin to open their mind and open their agenda. And so rules and relationships become, part of the energy of how we change a community. Sometimes the rules, things like ADA, other laws that we passed, do certain things, but the real goal is to prop up relationships. And so this idea of social capital really requires a lot of the things that you see in this image, right? It requires a sense of diversity, that people feel a sense of belonging, that networks that allow for both bridging as well as bonding, and folks to feel trusted and to feel safe, and to have an opportunity for participation, and to recognize that people are citizens, not clients, and that struggle happens a lot with organizations that are focused in on a particular situation or disability. They tend to see the person that they're supporting as kind of like a client who has some issues, and those issues need to be resolved in order to participate. What we're talking about today is this broader sense of citizenship, and this broader sense of investing in becoming a player in the system. And so, excuse me, that should never happen. That should be on silent. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So in understanding social capital, we know certain things about social capital, that we have people that we're acquainted with, people that we do things with, people that we bonded with, right? And in thinking about community as the platform for people to begin to bridge an acquaintanceship, and then through the bridging of that acquaintanceship, begin to bond. And so the notion of setting the platform for people to have conversations becomes a key element to changing a culture, right? That when people have the opportunity to communicate, when people have the opportunity to talk and to engage with each other, that begins to level the field. But getting to that point where literally the community wants to listen to what someone brings to the table and doesn't have their preset assumptions and perceptions becomes in many ways a stumbling block, because it's not our differences that divide us, it's our judgments about those differences that do that. And so when we think generally about community and we think about the community judgments that are there, that these are the kinds of walls that get in the way of, full and equal participation in whatever that community's agenda is. Now, remember, we did, when we defined community, we really talked about it as being a network of different people who come together regularly for something in common, right? And it's that common sort of that common agenda that invites people into that mix. So how do we change community, right? What can we do in making community more viable, right? Well, obviously, we have to, those of us who are on the call that represent or that support a particular vulnerable group, whether they're folks with intellectual disabilities, people with physical disabilities, folks that are struggling with mental health issues, poverty issues, elderly issues. We have to, I think, let go of our micro inclination and really promote more individual opportunities for participation, right? And so, how do we build community? What are the things that we can invest in our work, our agency's work, or our individual work, in terms of building, a community where everybody belongs, where people are invested. Okay. Now, some of these ideas, they might not seem to have anything to do with disability specifically, or whatever your intentionality is, and that's exactly the reason I'm recommending them, is because these are investments that I'm going to recommend in community. And I've pulled these investments out from a variety of research that I've done, things that I've actually participated in individually or through my own organization, or things that I discovered or learned from colleagues around the world. And they're projects that can be done. And when these projects manifest, the softening of community follows this, right? Now, this is really hard to measure because we don't know for sure if some of these things that I'm going to recommend or suggest or talk about in terms of carrying out, if we don't know for sure that these things, anytime you do social science research or community research, you're getting your best sense of an issue. right? But it's not precise like chemistry might be precise. Social science research, social science interventions are not, they're not algorithmic, or they're not fully aligned. But based on what individuals and what organizations have discovered in doing some of these things, I think have yielded some really cool things. Right? Eric Kleinenberg said, when people engage in sustained and reoccurrent interaction, particularly while doing things that they enjoy, relationships inevitably grow. Right? Now, this is an important quote. And Kleinenberg, as a sociologist who focuses in on social infrastructure, as he knows, that then the goal here is that people who have been left behind, or who have been on the periphery of community, when they have the opportunity to in fact participate, relationships start, right? This is also a really important point to think about from your own life. And you think about any relationship that you have today that's meaningful to you, that's really important to you, wherever it might be, maybe at work, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe, in your church, or in a club or a group that you belong to. And you stop and you think about, how did, just in your mind, go back to, how did that relationship initiate? Like, how did I become friends with Jim, right? Or with Sally, or with whomever? How did that start, right? And you begin to track back on that. You come to discover that you were probably in the same place at the same time, doing something that you liked or enjoyed with that person that initiated that relationship. And the more you saw them, the more you began to see their humanity. They began to see your humanity, and the relationship initiated, right? And so, the first of the ideas that I want to share with you is an idea called coffee connection, right? And we all know, the aura of a coffee shop, right? And probably everybody on this call has their favorite coffee shop, Starbucks, or where Panera, or wherever you might stop for maybe a local community coffee shop that you stop and get your coffee. And now, coffee shops, when you think about them, play an interesting role in community building, going all the way back to cafes, in Europe, where coffee shops became sort of the bastions of conversation, right? They became these settings where where people felt like they could have dialogue with other people, right? Now, over time, coffee shops have morphed. They're not nearly as romantic as that sounded, and that still exist in a lot of European cities. We Americans have taken the aura of coffee shops and kind of just turned it into almost a fast food. Go in, you even text your order, you run in and just grab the bag, and you have an account, and then you hustle back to your car, or hustle back to wherever you're going. But one of the things that, in terms of building community, is to think about this idea of coffee shops, and this idea, this coffee connection idea, sort of goes like this. And I'm going to tell you how we've done it. I actually participated in doing this kind of a thing in Pittsburgh in a couple different coffee shops. But here's how the coffee connection works. Right? You identify a coffee shop in your community or near your community, and you might you might even go and ask to talk to the manager or the the owner to really talk about the agenda that you have about creating community where people are welcomed and have an opportunity to participate, right? You don't have to get into a lecture, but I think just reminding perhaps the owner or the general manager about the role that coffee shops have played, and the idea here, and this is how we did it. We identified a coffee shop near where our agency is located. When I was working, I ran an organization, as Sue told you in the introduction, an organization called Class, an agency serving folks with disabilities in Pittsburgh, and so we identified this coffee shop called Biddles, right? And Biddles has been in our community, and the community is called Regent Square, and Biddles has been there, for years. So we went to talk to Mr. Biddle. His family has owned this coffee shop over many years, and we talked a little bit about this idea of trying to create more conversation, more opportunity for people to engage. And we shared with him, we had this idea where we would buy sleeves, the sleeve that goes over the coffee cup, that when you go into Starbucks, you put on so you don't burn your hand. So we ordered these coffee sleeves, and we had them printed up. We did this, at our produce area called the Strip District, and we went to a little production place, and on the sleeve, on one side it said "Open for conversation," and then on the other side, the back side of the sleeve, you can close those sleeves up. I don't have one here to show you, but on the other side of the sleeve, it said, sorry, working on a report, right? Or busy, or, can't talk, or whatever, open, closed kind of message. And so when the baristas served the coffee to people coming into Biddles and put the sleeve on, and they handed the coffee to the customer, the customer said, well, what's this? He said, well, if you're going to stay here, and you're going to, we'd like you to stay and enjoy your coffee. But if you're open to some conversation with other people in the coffee shop, just turn your sleeve to the open side, and other people will see that and can, perhaps engage in a conversation. If you don't want to engage in a conversation, if you're busy or you're working on a report or whatever, just turn your sleeve the other way, and folks will know not to bother you or to realize that you're indisposed, right? And the customers were a little bit like, what? They were a little bit wondering about this, but as over a day or two, folks started to follow the instructions right on the sleeve, and is they either gave permission to talk or permission or did not give permission to talk based on how they turned their cup. And so as we began to follow this, we started to watch it. We wanted to see what kind of conversations might happen, if any. You never know when you're doing something like this. But it really was amazing. In fact, we had the councilman, the city councilman who represents the Regent Square where Biddles is. We had him come a couple mornings and hang out. And actually he would, he got a coffee and he'd go and see if somebody had it open, and he'd sit down. And of course he's, everybody knows him there. He's his name is Corey O'Connor. He's a great councilman. And just, how you doing? What do you think about what's, he just started conversations with people. And so the energy in Biddle started to, just started to increase, and people, began to discover each other, and folks would go over to somebody who had their coffee sleeve open and say, gee, I've seen you. Did you live near here? Are you new in the community? Or, I've been here forever. Just these conversations that started to unfold, right? Now, one of the things that we did at Biddles was we would have folks that we were supporting in terms of building relationships who lived in Regent Square. We would, we would have our community partners, which is what we called our staff, take a person over to Biddles. And Biddles was accessible. And they would go in, get the coffee, and they would kind of look for a place to sit and then engage, in small talk, in those very first sort of initial conversations with people. And those are, small talk is not easy. I mean, think about sometimes how paralyzed you feel if you go into a party or you're at a reception somewhere and you're by yourself, making small talk with people is not easy, right? But yet that's the first step in relationship building, is making small talk. So the coffee connection idea is one that just adds a resilience to a community. It's just one little idea. You question and say, well, what does this have to do with disability? Yeah, no, it's more around creating conversation, right? So our second idea is similar, and this is an idea that really initiated in the UK, and I'm sure it's happened in other places as well. But in the UK, I think you remember when we had our session on loneliness and isolation, I talked about how the UK, Great Britain, has established a minister of loneliness, reporting right to the Prime Minister, to really try to find ways that loneliness can be addressed in the UK. And one of the things that they've done is this communication bench idea. So what they did is they started initially, the Minister of Loneliness started this initiative in London and in Hyde Park. And essentially what they did was identify, benches that were in the community where, as people were strolling through Hyde Park, would sit and rest a bit. And on that bench, they put a plaque very similar to the sleeve on the coffee connection idea. And the plaque just said, welcome to Hyde Park. If you're, if you're enjoying this bench, feel free to say hello to, a person sharing the bench with you. It just gave permission for people to talk. And the notion of people kind of coming and sitting on a bench to, just to relax or enjoy the outdoors, and then somebody sitting with them where there's permission to talk, to say hello, just to get to know your neighbor. And again, a simple-minded idea. It's there's, clearly you don't know for sure, is this going to make our community better or not? I don't know. But I think a community where people have an opportunity to talk to one another and feel like they can is the first step towards softening a culture. Okay? So that's the community connection idea. And these community benches can actually function the same way. Now, oftentimes in a project like this, you need to connect with your parks and recreation department of your town, and again explain some of the agenda of of what your organization is about. Your organization is really about creating a community where each belongs, and that to that end, you have a vested interest in your community being receptive, right? And being more approachable, right? So identifying benches in your community, outdoor space where people rest or gather, preparing a plaque with an inscription. Now, there's some cost to something like that. Having it installed, having the inscription installed. Again, this could be a collaboration with the Parks and Rec Department, or and even that kind of a partnership is beginning to reach into the macro domain and beginning to say, we all have a vested interest together in a community where people belong. Again, same kind of thing that can happen though in a targeted way with if you're supporting someone who has a disability or is really looking to build more relationships, and you're out for a walk in the park, sitting down on a bench saying hello to someone, again, becomes the first step in relationship building. You could keep city officials abreast of how this seems to be working. You could get graduate students to observe, are people actually conversing when they sit down at a bench. You can try to begin to measure some of this. So, these ideas just give you options to say, how would you tailor something like this as you're investing in your community? The notion of inclusivity, right, is at the core of these ideas. It's at the core of everything we've talked about in this entire series, and building community and having respect for everyone to be welcomed is part of the agenda of inclusion, right? And this next idea really speaks to this from a sense of your organization's presence in community, right? Each of us, any of us, all of us are associated with, I don't know, some organization that has some presence in a community, right? Now, many of us who, like, for example, I worked for close to 50 years for CLASS, Community Living and Support Services. We have, an agenda to support folks with all types of disabilities. And so, we had a center, right? A place where we did our work. Our staff would arrive there. We had some skill building things that happened at our center, and there were classes that we offered at our center, mostly for folks with disabilities. So what we really decided to do was to see if we could take our center and create a reverse inclusion agenda, right? Now, we first did this. This was years ago when we launched this, and our center was located in Oakland section of Pittsburgh. And now Oakland, if you're familiar with Pittsburgh, is near where the university is. University of Pittsburgh is in Oakland. Carnegie Mellon University is also in Oakland. And so Oakland is this really interesting amalgamation of people. And there are students and there's faculty who live all around Oakland, and there's folks who are poor, and families, and it's a very mixed kind of community. Some commercial places in and around the Oakland area. And we had a presence in Oakland. We first opened the center there in 1980. So we had been in Oakland for a lot of years. What we, as we began to really get wanted to get more invested in community as an organization. And we looked at our center and we said, holy moly, we have this center, we got parking, it's accessible, it's bright, it's airy. Maybe this center could be used for things over and above our work with people who have disabilities, right? So what we did is, we began to say, let's see about creating a reverse agenda and become a more of a community center than a disability specific service, right? So, all of this required obviously conversation with stakeholders, organizational stakeholders, and especially with our board of directors, right? And I would spend at every board meeting at least 30 minutes of the usual 2 hours that we had our board meetings to talk about community and our values and what we believed and how we wanted to get people more involved in community and relationships and social capital, right? And so, I shared with the board that I thought we ought to open our center up and have it serve the greater community, as well as continue to, provide some specific supports to people with disabilities. And some of our board members struggled with that. They said, wait a second, our agenda is to, help people with disabilities and their families. It's not to help the general community. And I would try to share and encourage them to sort of think more broadly that our goal is to get people into community. And so if the community doesn't see us as relevant, then that makes getting to the goal harder, right? So in any event, we ended up, our board agreed with this initiative. So what we did is, at the time, I was teaching in the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh. So I got a couple of my graduate students, and we did a community inventory. I sent the graduate students within a 1.5-mile radius of where our center was located. I had these students go knock on doors, right? And they would, go to the home or maybe the apartment building or whatever the setting was, and they would conduct a survey. And the survey was something like, if a community center opened up here in close to our neighborhood, what would you want it to do? What might be something that would be helpful to you? Right? And so we got all kinds of really interesting reactions to that question from the people who lived near where our center was. And lots of different, people said, oh, I'd like to, I'd like to have a place that was more convenient to vote at. And, gee, I'd like to have a place where maybe, we could have classes, where, there could be recreation sort of opportunities, maybe art, other kinds of things. We heard all these interesting ideas from that survey. We also, in the survey, embedded a couple questions about what did they think our organization did, right? So we said, class, what do they do? And boy, we got, we discovered what people thought about it. Most people didn't even know who we were. And those who did had these really strange and weird sort of impressions of what we did and what we were about. So we took all these ideas and we culled them, and we began to say, let's begin to initiate them. So the first thing we did is we took the name of our organization off our building, and we just put a generic sign saying, Community Service Center. Just called it the Community Service Center. And we, we followed some of the low-hanging fruit. The first thing we did was we talked to the Elections Bureau, and we said, hey, we would be happy to be a polling place for our community. We're accessible. We have parking. It's comfortable. It's well lit. And so we became a polling place. We opened up a art gallery. It was community art. And what we did is not disability artists, although there were some folks with disabilities that showed their work, but every quarter we would invite a community artist to put their work in our center. And then they would have an opening, and the artist would conduct a little discussion about his or her art. The art would be displayed. The art was priced. Any art that sold, we split with the artist. So our gallery was able to continue on, and every quarter we had a different artist. So every quarter we had different sort of aura in our center, different kind of, it looked different every quarter. It had a new flair. And this brought a lot of people into the center. So as people come to the center, the other thing then we did was we opened up a small little cafe. It wasn't like a commercial enterprise. We had some folks that we were supporting who could actually could run the cafe. We initially started with soups, and when people would buy a bowl, it was just a donation. We gave a recommendation, but folks, if they didn't have any money at all, they would still give them soup. So and so we ran the Duck Pond Cafe every Friday, right? So people started coming in for soup, and pretty soon people didn't really, they didn't even see us as a disability organization. They just saw us as a community resource, and folks that we were supporting were there, and they were involved, and there was this sort of amalgamation of people that was really robust, right? We were able then to go after some community development grants to add to some of the things that we were doing. In fact, one of the things we learned in our survey was that people who lived in Oakland near our center would always complain about the streets the sidewalks would be snowy. They would plow the streets, but the sidewalks would just remain. Some people would shovel their sidewalks, other people couldn't, or just weren't able to for whatever reason. So we sat down with our councilman, and we put a grant into community development, CDGB, community development block grants, and we bought some snow blowers, and we bought a little shed. We were able to build the shed in the back behind our center. We kept the snow blowers in the shed. Whenever it would snow, we had we created a little ladder, a volunteer ladder. We'd call people, they'd come up, they'd get the snow blower, they'd do the sidewalk. So even things like that one would never think, an agency like CLASS has a responsibility for, began to sort of change how we were seen and how disability was actually seen in our community. So this reverse inclusion, where we sort of take where we're at and say, how do we share this jewel box, and how can we become more invested in our community? So that's the reverse inclusion. Now, one of the other things that's tagged on to reverse inclusion was this idea of community events, right? So once we created the Community Service Center, it was really an easy short step to start to host community events, right? Where we would do a fall festival. Again, this wasn't, an agency issue. It was a community fall festival. We'd get we'd get, farmers to bring some produce in, and cider, and, craft tables, and we would, these would all be done by, community players, not by our organization. Now, obviously, we were able to generate some dollars from this in terms of what people actually either sold. We would sometimes make them booths, rentals available. We did a fall festival, a holiday thing, a spring fling, a summer carnival. And these were all things that we were able to do in our community, with community participation, community involvement. We weren't there to promote our agency or to ask for donations or to somehow, some way, have our hand out. And the community officials were there, elected officials would come. Of course, they wanted to be seen, and so it really began to sort of change who we were as an organization, and allowed us to really broaden the agenda as an investor in our community. Right? So the next idea, and I just have two more, is a gatekeeper idea. Now, we've talked about gatekeepers in one of our sessions. Remember, we said a gatekeeper is somebody indigenous to community or to a group, and that gatekeeper, by welcoming somebody new, helps that new person become known in community. I mean, remember, I think the example I used when we talked about this was, think about when you first started working at your agency, who oriented you, who was assigned to show you the ropes, right? So the gatekeeper really becomes a strategic sort of, bridge builder for a newcomer. They welcome that, they help welcome the newcomer in, and they introduce the newcomer to other people in their setting. So here's the other idea, where we actually look at our own staff, and we think about the role our staff can play. We know the role they play formally, right? Their job description. This is a different sort of way of engaging with our staff, right? So what you do here is you conduct a cultural profile on your staff, right? That is, try to discover what your staff do when they're not working. What do they do in their communities? So they active in their church and the Little League Association? Are they in the community choir? What are the things they do? Now, some of this you already know just through small talk that people make over the water cooler or the coffee urn. But this is a very dedicated idea where you actually survey your staff, and then you commensurately survey some of the people you're supporting, right? And then you look for a possible match. You say, well, gee, Jim likes music and Al is in his community choir, right? Maybe there's, a connection where Al might escort Jim to his choir and begin to help Jim become known, in the choir. Maybe Jim can actually join the choir, and Al's already going anyway, right? And so now there's some tenuousness to this, in that, do you pay the staff for their time, or are there other rewards that you can offer? Do you change their schedule so that when they go to their choir, it's actually work time? The key is that you want to try to find the gatekeeper who's already invested in their community and facilitate somebody new joining this. Let me give an example. I actually, when we initiated this at our agency, I was the guinea pig, if you will, in that I was active in, at the time, I was active in the Little League Association in my community. And I was a coach, and I was, went to Little League, meetings, coach meetings. And when I would go there, people didn't know where I worked or what I did. They just knew me as a good coach, and that the kids liked me, and that I liked the kids, and so we were supporting a guy at the time who really loved baseball. He had cerebral palsy. He used 2 Lofstrom crutches to walk. So I started to take Bill with me to my coaching assignments with the Little League Association. Right? And again, Bill would just come with me. I introduced him to the other coaches and the families, and Bill coached third base, and began to get involved with us, with the coaches. Even after the games would go out for a beer, Bill would come and just be a part of that Little League Association, right? So the notion here is, do we already have gatekeepers in our staff? And the answer is, of course we do. Yes. Now, how we use them becomes challenging. Do we enlist them to do that? Some staff don't want to, that's their private time. They don't want to be working on their, so there's some of that clutter, but there's also some of that incredible opportunity. Same thing with your board. Your board members are involved in things in their community, and maybe might be able to escort somebody you serve to things that they're going to do. I mean, this really helps board members understand the agenda of community inclusion, right? So just thinking about some of this kind of low-hanging fruit. So here's, I think, the last idea here. And these little free libraries, I don't know if you've seen them in communities, but communities, municipalities, many of them have begun to create these little birdhouse libraries, right? And people will donate books, and sometimes, like the Rotary will do this, or the Kiwanis, or a service group to a community, and they will stock and make sure they monitor that the items that are in there are appropriate kinds of things, and that they're things are clean and well displayed, kind of in the community. These are things that your organization might be able to do. If you you have an investment in your community, maybe if you're providing residential supports, and there's some people that you support that are living in a community, maybe you send your staff to scout around and see, are there anything like this in your community, and then maybe this is something you could do by identifying a target community, maybe soliciting supports from the community officials to be able to do something like this, maybe get a small grant to build or buy these birdhouse library frameworks, install them in key settings, monitor them. You might even stock them by doing a book drive in your community, asking people just drop off some books. And now, again, this takes time to do, to generate. It's an investment that you make, but literally these are things that soften our community. And they're things that literally are project kind of oriented. They take us more down the macro lane of community. So we know the community is a network of different people come together for something in common, and that similarities connect people, and that regularity and similarity begin to bond. people. And all community ideas are a blunt instrument if they don't have behind them a living kind of a spirit of investment in our community and wanting to see a community that really is open and respectful. Because we know that when people build relationships in community, it just creates a better community setting where people are more responsible to each other. They're more tolerant, more respectful. Just good things follow. We covered some of this in our program earlier. So this idea of cooperation and collaboration are the things that create an investment in community. And so my plea to you and my what I'm encouraging you to think about is let's broaden our agenda so that we can, in fact, truly invest in community, in making community viable and vibrant for everyone. There must be a beginning to any great matter, but continuing until the end, until it be thoroughly finished, really yields the true glory. And clearly, I am convinced with my 50 plus years in the field as an advocate that all the things that we're doing or trying to do that are individual to our constituent base, those things are just not going to bear fruit until we really commensurately invest in our communities and that we become players in the community. We don't expect somebody else to do this. We take initiative to do this. And so let me finish with this little poem, anonymous poem that I found about community. And it goes like this: in community lies strength of numbers to support the sick and the weak. In community, somebody hears me with louder voices to speak. In community lies public purpose to shield from the harshness of life, to offer and receive common friendship, to protect from the gun and the knife. In community, we teach each other about science and art and sport. And from this, we gain our vitality, and through this, our sickness is fought. In community, others surround us, their dreams, their loves, and their faces. Encourage our hearts to prosper, our minds to accept other places. In community, disaster may come, but grief and faith in all ours makes death's pall linger less strongly, and our tears with others can fall. In community lies men's ambition. Without makes larger our fears. And together we make sense of being and bringing joy and length to our years. And so as we finish up this session, like we typically do, I wanted to leave time for conversation, for questions. If you have any questions, we wanted you to put them in the chat box. Jamie will kind of cull through. But I also, like I have from the very first session that we did, put up some contact information for me. If we don't get a chance for a question that you have, or if there's something you want to, further explore, know that I'm happy to engage in that kind of conversation. Here's some contact information for me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to go into our Brady Bunch matrix. And I'm going to ask Jamie if there's any questions that you had about some of these ideas of investing in community in an effort to, create a setting where everybody belongs. Jamie, do we have anything that came into the chat room that we might explore?
We have a few comments. So let's see here. I can see the gatekeeper initiative being possible in schools, being one of them. Jennifer said, very good presentation. Thank you. Sue said, it seems there is a delicate balance between facilitating relationships which occur naturally and making a project out of the person with a disability. And then we have Kathy who said, hello, Al, enjoyed the presentation, thanks. Comment from Lynn. Many schools in this area have created a buddy bench on the playground, similar to the communication bench idea.
Right.
And Deb says, CDE would love to meet the gatekeepers that you know.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let me just react to a couple of the points that that came out. The gatekeeper issue. We talked about our staff playing gatekeeping roles. That's obviously the idea that I wanted to present. But know that there's really been some interesting things done around the gatekeeper idea. For example, in the mental health community, there's an effort that's been done called Compeer, COMPEER, right? So if you Google Compeer, you'll find there's been a lot of Compeer-oriented projects that have been done, mostly in the mental health community, but can be done really anywhere. And the way they work is very similar to the idea that I put forward in terms of our staff playing gatekeeper roles. But what the Compeer agenda does is number one, they put out a call, like the Mental Health Association might put out a call for volunteers, saying, we're looking for people who might want to volunteer and help the work. We're working to build a community where everybody belongs, and we need volunteers to help us with that. If you're so inclined, please join us. Let us know. Here's a link or whatever. And when volunteers sign up, they inquire and they sign up to volunteer with the Mental Health Association. The Mental Health Association will sort of invite them into a meeting, right? So the volunteer shows up at the meeting, and at the meeting, the volunteer fills out some forms, right? Just some contact stuff, and so we know where they're at and how to get a hold of them, kind of thing. But they also fill out an inventory of things that they do in the community, just things they're interested in, like a profile, like a cultural profile, and then while the volunteer is there at the center for this meeting where they're filling out these forms, they do two kind of official things. One is they do an overview, like a mental health 101 overview, just so that the volunteer understands a little bit about mental health issues and how sometimes they manifest, and as best as we can to demystify mental health as an issue. They also will do any diligence necessary with funding sources. Like sometimes you have to do clearances, or you have to somehow, some way get, you get the person approved in some kind of a formal way to volunteer. In the intellectual disability community, you have to get these kind of clearances before you can volunteer. So I mean, those are I think that's overkill, but the system has done that. So you get those things formed in that very first meeting, get over those humps, those systems humps, and then that's a matching issue, right? So from the profile, if Al Condeluci is going to volunteer at the Mental Health Association, I fill out the profile and identify the things I like and that I do in my community. Then they attempt to do some matching. Say, okay, well, Al, we have, it's almost like a big brother, big sister kind of a thing. But it's like, Al, we have, we know that you're interested in jazz music and you're involved in the Jazz Society. And, we support someone who's really a jazz aficionado. Maybe you can take him to your jazz society meeting, or be with him, just join him, or him joining you in attending the meeting. And so the volunteer then begins to do that. So the volunteer is already like a built-in gatekeeper, because what you're really looking to do is to match to something that the volunteer is already invested in, or already is known at. Okay. Now, having said that, I think the notion, I think Sue brought up about a project, doing something that can sometimes happen naturally as a project, that there is a thin line there. And there can be perversions in things like that. And so I think we go into this kind of stuff eyes wide open around the kinds of things that might pervert the intentionality of this. But in the end, this is really about getting people invested in community, people who have been left behind or maybe at the sidelines, and getting them invested. And we do this as just a passage of life. Yesterday, I was just interesting experience. Just yesterday, it was a beautiful day here in Pittsburgh, and I had a little bit of time in the afternoon, so I snuck out to play some golf. And I was with a buddy of mine, and we go to this little golf course. It's a little 9-hole golf course. It's not an executive course, but similar. And so there was just two of us. They paired us up with this guy and his son. His son was young, 8th grade, 9th grade. And so we played together, the four of us. And the dad, he was really kind of cool. He wanted, to introduce his son, who was just starting to learn golf. But he wanted his son to understand the etiquette of the game. He wanted, his son to obviously, play, well, but also to build relationships. So I heard him prompt, his son saying, if they hit a nice shot, we tell them nice shot, that's what we do. Right. And what he was doing is he was helping his son understand the world of golf, right? And golf etiquette, which is part of that infrastructure, that you don't talk when somebody's putting, and things of that nature that golfers know, that he wanted his son to know. He's more interested in that than actually, his son hitting a great shot, right? Because he knew that was the stuff that was going to start relationships, right? And so those kinds of things are around us, and I think the spirit that I'm suggesting some of this is not a project with a person with a disability. It's really thinking more about the finesse of community and how we get from point A to point D, right? And we got to go through B, C, and C in order to get there. And the ways that we can engineer some of that to make it happen for people. Any other questions? I see the chat room got some other things going. So what else do we have in there, Janie?
Of course, I would forget I'm muted.
Zoom etiquette.
Lynn asks, any examples of how a person with IDD being personally involved with a little free library? What was their role and their level of participation? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this project is one that I haven't personally done, but I've, talked to people who have done these kinds of things. And there's a couple different ways that people can get engaged in a little free library initiative. One is obviously to help think about where we would have these. Now, sometimes they have to be prescribed by the municipality or by the community, determine where that would go. But conducting a book drive, helping to clean up the books and code them so that, you know, there can be some tracking. The actual building, you know, I know that a group that has done this actually had a workshop where they built and people participated in building them, painting them, making sure that they were really attractive. The monitoring of them by making sure that we go to where the little library settings are, just to assure that, you know, someone hasn't stuck something in there that, you know, is inappropriate, or that they're clean, the glass is clean so people can kind of see through, that there hasn't been any damage. So there's that, there's a lot of different sort of points of intersection where participation can occur in a project like that really goes to trying to, you know, I've just seen with the pandemic, folks have put out like little, they're not libraries, they're places for food stuff to be canned and non-perishables, to actually be available for folks who might be hungry or food insecure. So there's, you know, the idea can extrapolate, but I think there's lots of points of intersection that folks can participate in, that can be like a project almost, that you get, you know, folks participating in. The intentionality is, how do we just make our community better places and softer places, and places that people feel, you know, nurtured and feel welcomed.
Before I say this last one, I just want to say, we do have a Google Drive, and I did leave it in the chat, with all of the handouts, all of the copies of previous PowerPoints on it. And I will also be putting, if you don't mind, Al, because I know you shared it through PowerPoints, your contact information
Correct.
on Google Drive, in case anybody has any questions.
Yes.
And I want to say one last question before I turn it over to Sue. Marley asks, can you speak on how staff can keep a certain level of boundaries as they act as gatekeepers?
Yeah, well, that is such a great question, because this is, you know, there is a you know, a volatility in something like this, where we there are boundaries in life, but, you know, some of this has already, you know, begin to happen. I know that in some of the residential things that I've been involved in, staff have just really gotten so close to folks that they're supporting, that they've invited them over for Christmas dinner and you know, go on vacation with them and things of that nature. And so there is that fine line of, you know, what is work and what is something that an individual does, you know, staff member does just to you know, as a citizen in their community. And, you know, some people might really be uncomfortable with something like that, or not want the responsibility, or if something goes awry, you know, feel, oh my God, you know, I'm liable in this situation. So there is some due diligence necessary. We don't, in something like this, we also don't want to bring lawyers in, you know, because the minute we ask a lawyer or we ask a insurance adjuster about doing a project like this, oh my God, all the red flags go up, and you know, oh my God, you know, this is gonna, you're exposed, and you know, your agency is exposed, we can't do this. And so a lot of really kind of cool possibilities get stunted by overkill that we do. Now, I understand that, you know, we obviously don't want to make ourselves liable as an organization. But on the other side of the coin, you know, when you get into macro stuff, you get in micro stuff you can control, right? It's like a laboratory. Macro stuff is messy, right? And things can go awry. and somebody can be victimized, or oh my, God forbid something bad really happened. And especially if the person is, vulnerable. I mean, there are those kinds of risks. But on the other side of the coin here is that if we can't live in a bubble, right? We cannot say, well, they're on the autism spectrum, so we really got to make sure that they don't get, they ever be exposed to something that might be harmful. I mean, life is risk, and that there are those kinds of things. We want to think it through. We want to be thoughtful. We want to try to put in as many safeguards as we can. But in the end, we just got to kind of put it out there and see how it goes. I don't want to be cavalier on this, but on the other side of the coin is that, risk is inevitable in life. And we can never, ever protect people from, even in programs, staff can abuse people, bad things can happen. Somebody could have money stolen from them or whatever. There's always going to be risk. But I think if we go through it with thoughtfulness and as the highest integrity as possible, I think we're going to have greater successes than we're going to have in terms of failure. So let me toss it over to Sue. I think we're almost at the bewitching hour. Any questions that people have, please forward them to me directly if you can. I'm happy to serve them. Know that Sue and I and Deb and the leadership team are going to be talking more about maybe next steps or where we go from here. But I want to thank all of you who have plugged in, and especially folks who have been through the whole 5 sessions. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thanks for your openness and your vision of creating a community where everybody belongs. Sue?
Yeah, I second that. Everybody who has participated in this, as an agency, obviously, we are passionate about this initiative and moving forward on it. So we are really interested in those of you who have participated, particularly those in Central Ohio, who might be interested in working with us on developing these kinds of relationships and making this initiative go forward. Just a heads up, on July 26th is the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we have determined that we are going to make inclusive communities part of that discussion on that day. We're going to attempt a live event, socially distanced, following all the guidelines, of course, but that you all get an invitation for that if you'd like to participate. Thank you. Don't hesitate. As Al said, he's very approachable and reachable. So approach him with questions or keep in touch with us. And thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Al.
Pleasure was mine. We'll be talking.